Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is John Myhock. He's the Director of Innovation and AI and Senior Architect at JTech Data Solutions. John, good to have you with us today. And let's begin right at the beginning here when people want to use the cloud as a source of backup and data protection as opposed to building a second data center, which agencies have done for all these years. There's got to be a better way that's less expensive and more efficient than that. Let's talk about the challenges of doing that and how you kind of set the groundwork for having a better strategy for backup and data protection.
Sure. So one of the things we find is that, the cloud is relatively new compared to other technologies. And I think, like you mentioned, for years, the government agencies have done it the way of building a secondary data center. So this is kind of a new paradigm of operating for a federal agency. So that's kind of the first challenge, is to introduce something new. It's not just a new technology, it's a new way of operating your whole enterprise. And it can be kind of scary because you're moving data possibly to a perceived uncontrolled environment that government agencies are used to having complete control. So you have to give up a little bit of that. And you're giving up not only control of where your data is, but control of how the systems are completely. And that's kind of one of the kind of foundations of cloud, is they do a lot of the stuff for you, where the government is used to doing a lot of that stuff for themselves. So I think those are some of the first challenges you're going to come across.
And so would it be safe to say that agencies should expect a different way of working with the data center if there's a backup there and the cloud? Because as you point out, a lot of the services that you would operate yourself are part of the cloud infrastructure, part of the service offering. And therefore, you'd have two different ways of dealing with the cloud versus your own data center.
Yes, that's true. So yeah, I would say depending on what services in the cloud you're using, there's different levels of customer responsibility and cloud service provider responsibility, where you have a SaaS service, which is software as a service. The cloud service provider is pretty much responsible for everything, except for your data and how you use the application. And then you kind of go down the stack towards IaaS, which is infrastructure as a service, where the customer is more responsible for deploying applications and locking down servers, et cetera, where on the data center, you're always responsible for all of that.
Yeah, so some groundwork then you really need to do to decide what it is you're going to do with respect to that cloud and the range of services potentially that you could take advantage of.
Yeah, it's really, where do you want to come in at? If you have a certain tolerance for not being flexible, and you want to give up some of that to the cloud service provider, you gain ease of use, right? So you're not tinkering around with configurations where you might, in on-prem situations, you don't have to worry about that. It's kind of configured for you. We'll talk about what FedRAMP is later, but that's kind of a security structure in place that as a customer, you don't have to worry about. It's certified. You're good to go. When you're on-prem, there's security implications that you have to worry about, take care of on your own.
And can JTech help an agency maybe navigate through some kind of a checklist or a set of questions to ask in preparation to that migration?
Yeah, I think the first step is talking to your customer and saying, what are you trying to achieve? What are your goals? What this we're talking in context of DR right now. What are your DR goals? Do you want something quick and easy that's scalable? Do you want something that's highly configurable? There's a million questions you can ask, but I think you got to get to the point where you have some good requirements, and those requirements match up with those agencies' goals that, and it supports their mission. So once you have all that together, then you can kind of look and say, okay, where do we lie in the spectrum of, at the top, do we want something that's software as a service, not configurable, everything's done for us? Or are we, more towards the bottom where we're configuring everything for ourselves?
And maybe walk us through some of the use cases or some of the case histories you've seen of different strategies agencies might have. For example, do you start with a certain level of security or CUI type of data before moving up the security chain as a example for how you would start?
Well, that is security again. That's across everything, right? So if you're DoD or a CI agency, you're restricted in what cloud regions you can go to. Pretty much GovCloud if it's certain FedRAMP level. But if you're like a civilian agency, your IL2, which is FedRAMP moderate, you have more options. So that's one thing. So then once you look at that, you're saying, okay, I know what my security posture is. What does my data look like? What kind of data am I trying to back up? There's been engagements where the agency's like, we want our servers, in the cloud. So that's one data set, right? You're talking about how I have I have a server on-prem with data in it, but I also have the OS, et cetera, in there. How do I move that to the cloud? Because that's a different set of processes than just moving, like, let's say, a file share back up to the cloud.
Yeah, so the data set is one thing, but the server that would operate it, that's something else. And what
Yeah.
about the consideration of how likely you are to access that data? I mean, if it's DR and backup and kind of disaster failover, then you hope you wouldn't access it very often. And that's a cost consideration too, isn't it? The
It
egress
is.
of the data.
Yes, egress of the data. Well, there's different situations too. So for one, like a lot of agencies, they'll have let's take like a user shares or some kind of CIF share that serves up data. That's just typically sitting on a NAS server. They want it backed up, right, in case the NAS server explodes or whatever. But there's also other cases where, hey, Joe went in and accidentally deleted this file. How do we get this critical file back without doing a complete restore? And that goes to the point of your data egress. Do you want to pull down an entire directory and share, or do you want to pull down that one file? So that's there's a cost difference there, a major one too. So those are a couple of things you want to consider when you're deploying your strategy to what you're protecting and how you're protecting it in the cloud.
We're speaking with John Myhock. He's Director of Innovation and AI and Senior Architect at JTech Data Solutions. And let's talk about some of the strategies for actually going once you know what your parameters are, your FedRAMP level requirements and so forth. How do you actually do this, and what kind of tool sets might be there to help?
Okay. So first, the first thing you need to know is your workload, what your enterprise looks like, what apps you have running, and most cloud service providers like Amazon and Azure, they have kind of a framework, right? Typically, it's going to be called like the 6R framework or similar, and it's really looking at, I have an app, do I rehost it, replatform it, do I rebuild it? Do I scrap it and go with a cloud native service? And in case of DR, sometimes it's less flexible, but that's kind of like the first step you go through, and looking at, how am I going to move this application to the cloud, whether it's permanently or DR. You kind of have to go through that. So are you looking at a lift and shift, or are you looking at, hey, we have all this data, why don't we take advantage of a cloud service that is, again, we're back to is it SaaS, is it IaaS, do we want scalability, do we want flexibility? That's kind of the first step you go through to do an analysis of knowing your workload. I say step two is do you have a cloud strategy in place? Are you going all cloud? In case of DR, not so much so. It's going to be more maybe hybrid cloud. And in that case, are you still running your main applications, your primary applications, and your data centers, or are you splitting some of them up? Are you moving some to the cloud? And with that, so that kind of develops your migration strategy as it pertains to each application. Again, security, that's an important factor in everything. So you're looking at, how do I secure this application in the cloud? Because it's not always, it's not always going to be the same as what you're seeing in your data center. And then, what's your application's availability? So again, a lot of these cloud services, they have the availability and scalability baked in. So you don't even have to worry about that. It's kind of the easy button, right? But if that just doesn't work for you, you have to have your servers in the cloud. Okay, well, do we do a multi-region deployment? Do we do a multi-availability zone deployment? Are we deploying load balancers? These are things that are, you see them in on-prem data centers, but they're slightly different in the cloud, but they're still applicable.
Yeah, so a question would be to evaluate the applications one by one in terms of what you need, should you need them. Sometimes they're mission critical. They have to run 24/7 and you can't have any downtime. Others, if it fails at midnight, 8 o'clock in the morning is fine to get it back up and running.
Yeah. Also, the environment too, right? If it's like this great point, like you said, if it's something that supports developers and developers only work 9 to 5, you're not worrying about it at 8 o'clock at night. And this is one of the things in the cloud that you can take advantage of is, if I'm not worried about it at 9 o'clock at night, should it even be on? Do I have to pay for it, when I'm not using it? So those are new considerations you're not seeing in the data center.
Yeah, so that's a real potential savings in that way, because if you own the facility, it's going to be on. Nobody turns their data center off and winds down all their servers. So it could be a potential savings just by virtue of having the flexibility of turning it off in the cloud.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can turn your stuff off in a data center. You're just not going to save money. Right. So, yeah.
Some of the machines the government has, you may not be sure they're going to come up again either.
That, yeah. So you, in the cloud, you get that assurance that I can spin my, nodes up and down, and I'm going to have a repeatable result within this environment. So
and what happens if you have a mission critical application that's one of those so-called legacy ones in older code that really don't run in the cloud? Is it, or you have to re-engineer them, as you said, or re-architect them or recode them or something like that, refactor them? Is it possible to simply store like a copy of it that has no runtime capability, but at least it's all preserved there, that you could pull back down and put in normal hardware?
You can store data in the cloud as long as there's a backup point. Like we'll get in to data domain, a Dell product, and how it can back up to the cloud. So if you have something like that as an endpoint and it's replicating to the cloud, then yes, that data is stored in the cloud. But like you said, if the code base isn't, you can't run it in the cloud, then you have the data there at least, but you may have to do some other type of orchestration to get that data back to a state where it can be run.
And you mentioned a Dell tool set. What is that all about, and how does that fit into this whole picture?
Well, Dell does have a set of tools that are cloud enabled. So you have data domain, which replicates to the cloud and is stored in cloud. Same with Avamar. And they have a cloud orchestration tool, which will take VMware virtual machines that are running on premises and convert them into, well, if it's Amazon and Amazon AMI, if it's Azure, it's an Azure instance. So either one, whatever you're running. I do believe they do Google. I focus more on Amazon and Azure being in the federal space. But so yeah, you're talking about converting what the state of the OS, like we talked about before, into something that can run into the in the cloud.
Yeah, so a lot of possible configurations and considerations here.
Yes.
Talk about, I guess this leads to a question I had about network addressable storage in the cloud, where to the network and to the application, the cloud just looks like a storage array or something. Is that a possible solution? And but your data is in the cloud, so it's safer than it is in the disaster-prone data center.
Really depends on the application. So in the cloud, they really have, object storage platforms, which aren't your typical file-based hierarchy, like which is, made to be human consumable. Object data stores are really a bunch of GUIDs, so it's not easy for a human to digest and kind of navigate, where it's a lot easier for a machine to. And that's really how like in Amazon it's S3, in Azure it's blob storage. But those platforms, they have the resiliency baked in, the availability baked in, and the performance baked in, because they can scale out for you. But it really depends on what you're using to access the data, because sometimes that's not enough. You still may need a server to access the data, like a web server or an application server. It's just not always available to be served.
So what are some strategies for making sure this is all going to work when you actually go live? I mean, I would think testing has got to be a big part of the planning and deployment process here.
Yes. So, and we'll get Paymon will get into in our customer success story, but part of it is, doing full live DR tests, not just when you deploy, but semi-annually. So you keep up with it, right? So you're doing a full DR cutover, spinning up in the cloud once or twice a year, and then also returning your running state back to your on-prem systems, because it's not a one-way street. So you have to be able to go out to the cloud, spin everything up, test and verify you're running, and then come back and say, okay, now we can come back and everything can spin up and run on-prem again as well.
And speaking about the clouds, of course, the domestic cloud providers that are doing domestic work for the government, or CONUS work, if you will, have more than one physical place where their cloud exists. They're coast to coast. So yes. I'm wondering if maybe a strategy is to consider the cloud the primary data center, if you will, because then you can have replicated and load balanced and performance enhanced instances across the country. Whereas when you're operating primarily out of a single data center, you've got all the latency and issues connected with network distances. So can you maybe reverse the whole paradigm, and your data center is the backup, so to speak, and the cloud is your primary source of operation?
I mean, you can. I would say, though, if you're already running in the cloud and you're adapted to it, you should have a resilient infrastructure set up where your backup is still the cloud. So in that sense, again, I was talking about, like, your app that's critical, it has 24/7 uptime. Did you do a multi-availability zone deployment? Did you do a multi-region deployment? In some instances, your DR really is, you're not doing a recovery, you're just running, because one region goes down, you have another region that's still running and able to serve that data.
And finally, just if you would review the main security thinking that has to happen here, because as I think you said earlier, you don't do anything nowadays as a federal agency without security foremost in mind, and every month seems to make that much more of an imperative.
Yeah. So when we're talking about security, again, what's your impact level? Are you, IL2? Are you above IL2? And that dictates what regions are available to you. If you're IL2, you can go into a couple different commercial regions. Northern Virginia East, there's West Coast California, one in Ohio. If you're above IL2, then you're in GovCloud. And that really just says that, the infrastructure you're running on has been certified and is continuously monitored to be certified. So you don't have to worry about that as you move into the cloud. Once you get into the cloud, you want to have a strong identity management foundation, which kind of centers on everything. And I think a lot of, traditionally, at least government agencies I've worked in and around, have Active Directory. and that's how they manage users. And the cloud does provide services for Active Directory, so you can, integrate into that if you need to. But the gist of that is that who's doing what in your environment, and that rings true whether you're in the cloud or on-prem. In the cloud, traceability, you want to, like in Amazon, you can, they have tools that you can monitor everything that's happening, not just for security but also for cost optimization, right? Like you want to know, hey, why do I have dev servers running in the middle of the night? You can trace those kind of things. And again, on-prem and in the cloud, you're going to probably have a SIM tool that monitors all security events. You're still going to need that. I think something in the cloud that you can have that traditional data centers may not have is more of a software-defined network that has a defense in depth model, where not only are you have perimeter security, but you have kind of a micro segmentation model where you can have servers in the same availability zone and the same subnet that can't talk to each other because they're blocked. And you really only want your services and servers talking to other services and servers that they need to do the work. You don't want it free and open. And the last thing with all of that is to automate your security to make it repeatable and reproducible.
We've been speaking with John Myhock, the Director of Innovation and AI and Senior Architect at JTech Data Solutions. Next, we'll be joined by Payman Parastaran. He's the Director of Innovation and Senior Architect at JTech Data Solutions. I'm Tom Temin. This is Federal Insights, Spotlight on Cloud, sponsored by JTech Data Solutions and Dell Technologies here on Federal News Network.